Welcome to Libeth. Today we are reading Bushido on two levels at once, what it says about the samurai, and what it is actually arguing about Japan's place in the world. Every text operates on more than one level, but Bushido operates on more levels than most, and the levels are not neatly separable. The literal surface describes 7 virtues and the practices that express them. The figurative layer encodes an argument about civilization, about Japan's place in the world, about what modernity requires of a people who want to remain themselves. And underneath both of these is a third layer that the book neither fully acknowledges nor fully conceals. The argument about what Japan needs to believe about itself in order to survive the pressure of Western power. These 3 layers produce each other. You cannot understand what the virtues mean without understanding the civilizational argument. You cannot understand the civilizational argument without understanding the psychological pressure that generated it. And the psychological pressure, the pressure of a nation watching its neighbors be colonized and choosing to modernize rather than be defeated, is visible on every page even when it is not mentioned. At the literal level, the 7 virtues are described with care and with genuine philosophical content. Rectitude, gi, is not simply honesty or justice in the Western legal sense. It is the capacity to hold to principle in the face of pressure, the refusal to allow circumstance to bend what ought to be fixed. Nitobe's illustration, the samurai who, when asked to do something dishonorable, refuses even at the cost of his position or his life, not because he is calculating that the long-term consequences of compliance are worse than the short-term consequences of refusal, but because compliance is simply not available to a person of his formation. The virtue is not a decision reached through reasoning, but a disposition constituted through practice. The person of rectitude cannot comply because the option has been removed from his available repertoire by the years of formation that made him what he is. Courage, is distinguished with equal care from recklessness. Nitobe's samurai is not brave because he is indifferent to danger, or because he lacks the imagination to understand consequences. He is brave because he has worked through the fear to the other side, because the fear of death has been metabolized, not suppressed, and what remains after the working through is not the absence of perception, but the absence of governance by what is perceived. The distinction matters, because it is the distinction between the formation Nitobe describes and simple brutality. The reckless man runs into danger because he has not thought carefully enough. The courageous man walks into danger because he has thought carefully enough to accept it. Courage in Bushido is an intellectual achievement as much as a physical one. Benevolence, jin, is the virtue that creates the most interesting tension in the system. The warrior's compassion must be distinguished from sentimentality, from the kind of pity that prevents necessary action, from the impulse to mercy that, in the wrong context, is simply another form of cowardice. Nitobe's samurai can be benevolent because he is also capable of violence. His compassion is chosen, not enforced by incapacity, and the choice is what gives it its virtue. This is a philosophically serious claim about the relationship between power and virtue. Only the person who has the capacity to harm and chooses not to can be genuinely benevolent. The person who is harmless is not benevolent. He is merely limited. Benevolence requires the prior possibility of its opposite. At the figurative level, these virtues are doing something more than describing the samurai type. Each virtue is performing a specific move in the civilizational argument. Rectitude performs the claim that Japan has a tradition of principled action independent of Western legal institutions. That Japanese ethical culture does not require courts and codified law to produce honorable conduct, because the conduct is produced by internal formation rather than external enforcement. Courage performs the claim that Japan's military tradition is philosophically grounded rather than simply brutal, that the warrior who fights for Japan is not a killing machine, but a formed person acting from considered values. Benevolence performs the claim that Japan's power, growing visible to the world through the Sino-Japanese War and the Russo-Japanese War, is not imperial aggression in the Western mold, but something more disciplined, more considerate, more governed by the same virtues that govern the samurai's conduct toward a defeated enemy. The sword chapter makes the figurative dimension most explicit. The sword is the soul of the samurai. Nitobe presents this phrase as if it were a translation of a Japanese proverb, and perhaps it is, but the use he makes of it is his own. The soul, in Western Christian vocabulary, is the immaterial part of a person, the part that cannot be destroyed, the part that constitutes identity in the deepest sense. To say that the sword is the soul of the samurai is to say that the weapon is not separate from the person who wields it, but constitutive of his identity at the most fundamental level. The samurai is not a person who has a sword. He is the person the sword makes him. His identity is organized around his relationship to the capacity for death, his own and others. And the sword is the physical embodiment of that organizing relationship. This is why the Meiji sword prohibition law was so destabilizing, and why Nitobe's chapter on the sword is implicitly a comment on that prohibition. The law said, the identity constitution that the sword represents is no longer legally recognized. You may continue to be a person, but you will no longer be that kind of person. The abolition of the sword as a public object was the abolition of a form of personhood. The Satsuma Rebellion was, at this level, not a political uprising, but an identity defense, the last attempt by the samurai class to maintain the conditions under which samurai personhood was possible. When the rebellion was crushed, the identity was not destroyed. It became, as Nitobe demonstrates, available for symbolic use in a context where the sword itself was no longer present. The soul survived the body. The tradition survived the class. And it survived precisely because Nitobe, and the Meiji state that found his vocabulary useful, needed it to survive. Seppuku presents the figurative reading at its most demanding. Literally, ritual suicide by a specific method in specific circumstances. Figuratively, the ultimate assertion of the principle that the self's integrity is more important than the self's continuation. The body, in Nitobe's account, is the instrument of the self's purposes, not the self itself. When the body has been so compromised by disgrace, by defeat, by the impossibility of fulfilling the obligations that constitute the self, that continuing to inhabit it means continuing to be someone the self cannot be. The self's response is to terminate the instrument. Seppuku is not self-destruction. It is the self's final act of self-governance, the last exercise of the discipline that characterized the samurai's entire life, applied to the ultimate circumstance. The philosophical paradox Nitobe presents here is genuine, and he does not dissolve it. If the self is the thing that chooses to die, what is preserved by the choosing? If the samurai who commits seppuku maintains his honor by destroying his body, what is the relationship between the honoring self and the destroyed self? Nitobe's answer, implicit rather than stated, is that honor is not a property of the body. It is a property of the relationship between the self and the community's standards. And when the body is gone, what remains in the community's memory is the honorable act of its destruction. The honor survives the person who enacted it. This is consistent with the rest of the system. Honor is constituted in the community's recognition, and the community's recognition can acknowledge an act that has already been completed by someone who no longer exists to receive the acknowledgement. The 47 Ronin are honored in the community's memory, long after all 47 are dead. The honor is real, the persons who enacted it are not. The invention of tradition mechanism runs through every chapter, and it becomes visible if you follow the sources rather than the synthesis. Bushido, as a unified system with 7 clearly defined virtues and a coherent philosophical structure, did not exist before this book. There were partial texts, the Hagakure, various domain codes, Confucian samurai treatises, the writings of individual swordmasters on the philosophy of their practice. These were not parts of a unified system. They were different, sometimes incompatible, expressions of a shared commitment to warrior values, produced in different historical contexts, by different social actors, for different purposes. The Hagakure's central claim, Bushido is the way of dying, is more extreme than anything Nitobe presents as the tradition's center. The Confucian samurai treatises are more moderate, more interested in governance and social obligation than in the aesthetics of death. The swordmaster's writings are more technical, more interested in the psychology of combat than in the broader philosophical framework Nitobe constructs around it. Nitobe unified these, selected from them, and presented the selection as the system. The text made the tradition by imposing a coherence that had not previously existed. The connection to Eric Hobsbawm's analysis of invented traditions is direct and important. Traditions that present themselves as ancient, continuous, and deeply rooted are often recent constructions assembled to serve present political needs, and their apparent antiquity is part of their political function. A tradition that has always existed cannot be questioned in the same way as a tradition that was made last year. Nitobe's Bushido appears ancient because it points backward to historical figures and events. The 47 Ronin, the great samurai of the Sengoku period, the Tokugawa-era masters. But the unified, coherent, 7-virtued system was assembled in 1900. The apparent antiquity is a product of the assembly, not evidence of a prior existence. The consequences of this construction stretch forward through the 20th century in ways that illuminate the mechanism. Ruth Benedict's The Chrysanthemum and the Sword, written in 1946 to help American policymakers understand the Japanese enemy, and then the occupied nation, is the next major Western construction of Japanese culture, and it shares Bushido's fundamental problem. It was written from the outside, by someone who had never been to Japan, using analytical categories derived from Western social science, applied to a culture those categories were not designed to illuminate. Benedict drew on Nitobe, among other sources. The chain of constructions runs forward and backward, each one building on and modifying the last, each one presenting itself as a description of something stable and real, each one being, in fact, a construction shaped by the needs and assumptions of the moment in which it was produced. The absorption of Bushido vocabulary into modern Japanese corporate culture is the tradition's most unexpected afterlife, and the one that reveals most clearly what the construction actually produced. The company, as the object of loyalty replacing the Lord. Long hours and self-sacrifice as the expression of commitment. Shame at individual failure as the discipline mechanism. Group solidarity as the community within which identity is constituted. The seniority system as the hierarchy of obligation. These patterns did not emerge spontaneously from some unchanging Japanese cultural substrate. They emerged from a chain of institutional formations: the Meiji educational system, the military, the post-war corporate structure that carried the Bushido vocabulary forward through each transformation. The ethics of the non-economic self became, through this chain, the ethics of total economic commitment. The tradition invented to demonstrate that Japan had values beyond material calculation became the tradition that justified subordinating every personal value to the demands of economic organization. Whether this is the tradition's deepest irony or its most consistent expression is a question that the book, for all its elegance, does not give us the tools to answer. That's all for today on Libeth. One new book every week. At least we try.